kind of difficult to know where to start with the British Grand Prix. So I think I'll start with Charles Leclerc saying after the race, most graciously, I thought, let's not let my disappointment colour the day of Carlos Sainz, of winning his first Grand Prix, winning it with Ferrari and winning it with Ferrari at Silverstone. All adds up to a very, very special day for the Spaniard, it's been a long time coming. Pole position in his 150th race start and then converting that into the Grand Prix win. I used the thumb yesterday, can Carlos do a Nigel? Well, he did a Nigel, and I got to tell you, Nigel is a massive fan of Carlos Sainz as well, so he would have been delighted. Nigel Mansell throughout the weekend making a point of wearing not a Williams cap, but a Ferrari cap, and showing his allegiance to Maranello and of course to Carlos Sainz, a driver that he really, really rates. So he would have been delighted by that. Not that that is significant in any way, of course, because the reality of today is that it belonged to Carlos Sainz. He was on the pole. He did win the British Grand Prix, and that is what the statistics are going to show when historians go back through the results with the passage of time. So congratulations to him and all the Sainz family. I imagine what his dad is feeling like now, just superb. Having said all of that, and this is where Charles Leclerc wouldn't be too upfront about it, I mean, what a drive by Leclerc, and what a mistake yet again by Ferrari. I was speechless after Monaco when they didn't put him on slicks. Quite obviously that was the move to make, even if you're at the front of the Grand Prix, particularly with a driver as talented as Charles. And then here, with an absolute gift safety car to put him onto a set of red soft tyres at the end, a new set, bearing in mind his Ferrari had been minus its front wing end plate, right front wing end plate from the start of the race virtually. Bearing in mind he had that damage, bearing in mind he'd driven unbelievably well with the car in that state, here was the reward, finally get a new set of soft tyres for the last 10 lap bash, and they didn't bring him in. They left him out on these old hard tyres. What was that all about? I mean, if after Monaco you could say, well, maybe Ferrari wanted to split their options. They weren't really sure what they were going to do. This time around, you've got to say, well, I don't know what you've got to say really, because to me, quite clearly, Charles was the quicker driver. He was the guy that had got to the front. He had passed Carlos Sainz in the middle phase of the race, despite the damage. And with Carlos really going as quickly as he could, they gave him every opportunity to get to a base lap time, and he couldn't do it. So he let Charles pass. And yet still, they left him out on the hard tyre, just left him out to dry, eventually to finish fourth. I mean, what was that all about? I found it quite nauseating to watch, because a driver of that quality doesn't deserve to be mismanaged so many times that way. And I'd be interested to know, really, I mean, I'm sure Charles is absolutely livid, and full marks to him for being so, as I say, gracious after the race and to talk about Carlos. But I've been saying from the start of the year that there's quite a big political drama at Ferrari between Carlos and Charles, not between the two drivers, but between the way the management and the politics and the board look at the two drivers. Charles is a driver of the older generation, the Arriva Bene generation. Carlos is one of the new guard. And on top of that, Carlos has everything going for him. He's got the charisma, he's got the package. Whereas Charles Leclerc is slightly more reserved, incredibly strong sense of character, keeps things to himself unless they're really brought out, and just gets on with it. So it's been a very difficult first half year for Charles Leclerc to live with that politics. He's got Jock Clear in his package there now in the garage, but it's not enough. I mean, quite clearly, it's not enough. What were they thinking, not putting him onto the soft tyre? It just defies logic, really. I feel very sad that his race was defined that way. As it was, of course, he brought the capacity Silverstone crowd to its feet, because on those hard tyres, with virtually no grip, on the last 10 laps, everybody was all over him. Sergio Perez, Lewis Hamilton, just superb in the Mercedes. We'll get on to him in a minute. But a jaw-dropping battle, and driving from Charles against Sergio Perez, Lewis Hamilton, particularly outside of Copse, other places where you shouldn't be at all. Just superb in a limping Ferrari. So yeah, just an outstanding drive, but sad that it was only for fourth place in the end. I found that absolutely soul-destroying. Anyway, moving on from that, great drive by Carlos Sainz overall, if you take the overall package. But let's go back to the start of the race, because for me, and the only word I can think about it is, the only adjective I can think of is cool. The coolest move of the weekend was when Red Bull revealed that Max Verstappen was going to start on soft tyres. I thought that was just totally mega. And it blew everybody else away, of course, because they're all on mediums. And there was Max on the dirty side of the grid, into the first corner, into the lead of the British Grand Prix. What a call. And of course, we'd seen how good Max was on those soft tyres, as I mentioned in the video yesterday, in FP3, in the dry. Just superb. And on the back of that, yeah, let's race that soft tyre. I thought that was a great call. But what a shame. Again, it didn't come to fruition at all, because we had the start line shunt. By now, I think all of you will have seen everything that happened. It looked as if Pierre Gasly went down the middle, saw a gap, tagged George Russell, and then basically everything went from there. The good news is, of course, that Guanyu Zhou is unharmed, and again, just an amazing advertisement for everything that Formula One has done, really, going back to, well, I trace it back to Jackie Stewart 66, but I'm okay if you want to trace it back to Ayrton Senna's passing in 1994 and the massive steps that were then made on circuit safety and car safety by Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley, and it's been continued through to this day. Just superb. The only worrying thing, of course, is the barrier, as cushioned as it was, did launch the car over a second fence, and that will need to be looked at, no question about that. And there were some bystanders very near there. I think there was a fence between the car and them, but nonetheless, debris could well have been an issue, and they were running like crazy to get out of the way, as you can imagine. It was not a good thing. But on the positive side, nobody was injured, as far as I know, in terms of the bystanders. Obviously not Guanyu seriously injured. And the car just magnificent, and the circuit magnificent as well. Full credit to all the safety people involved with the circuit layout, and to Silverstone circuits too, because that could have been absolutely horrendous. And it just gives you an idea. I think a lot of people get lulled into thinking, oh yeah, we're okay, Formula One is safe. And I've always said, accidents that happen on the straight, of course, are going to be the worst, because quite often the circuit isn't preparing for that, as we saw with the Romain Grosjean accident. And beyond that, how quickly they're going anyway. And this was an accident that effectively began on the straight. There was a lot of runoff area, which was a good thing, which was a great thing. But it was horrifying to watch, no question about that. And if you look at things like the halo and the roll bar and the general strength of the whole driver survival cell, just superb. Great to see him walking around the paddock after the race. Anyway, this was an interesting moment in the British Grand Prix, because the red flag came out as the leaders were just about to start to go flat out down the back straight, the first long straight. And because at that point not all the field had gone through the timing beam, and therefore there was no clear definition of what the full race results were, down to what would have been 16th, 17th place, of course, they decided that although it counted, and in the case of Max Verstappen, starting on the soft tyre counted as one of his tyres, and he could have actually, if he'd wanted to, if he'd been able to, he could have then switched to hards and done the full Grand Prix distance. Although that counted, they went back to the grid order, not the race order, for the restart, which took place 57 minutes, nearly an hour later. So that was a weird anomaly, because on the one hand, they're allowed to change tyres. On the one hand, his tyre choice did count. On the other hand, it was as if it was a brand new race again, going back to the original grid. Never seen that before in recent times. I don't think it's ever happened before, actually. And it's all because they didn't know that not all the cars had gone through the timing loop. So I guess it was a fair decision. But if you look back at the race now from Max Verstappen's point of view, if they'd restarted the race with him on the pole, even if he'd been on the mediums, which is what then he chose then to run on the restart, he probably would have won that race, because he would have been in a different position on the track. He may not have hit the same debris, which did damage to his car. So interesting point on which to reflect, I think. But the other point, of course, is that they chose to run Max then on the medium. They took him off the soft, which I'm amazed they did, because obviously it was a good enough choice to start the race with in the first place. What was it about the first four corners of the race that made Red Bull go to the medium and go back to square one for a start on the dirty side of the grid? Carlos Sainz's start from the pole wasn't a great one at the first start. So by the law of averages, Ferrari being as good off the line as they are, he was for sure going to make a good start in the next race, in the next start. But Red Bull put him on the medium then. And on the medium, of course, he didn't have anything like the same grip or advantage. And as they went into turns 1, 2, and 3, they were like this. I mean, Max was all over Carlos, putting a massive amount of pressure on him, and all credit to Sainz. I think if Carlos Sainz looks back at this and looks at the replays and remembers that opening lap of the second race, he'll think, wow, that's where I won this Grand Prix, because Max was all over him. But Carlos drove really well there and looked like a Grand Prix winner from that moment, at that moment, but not for too much longer, because Max then started to put quite a lot of pressure on Carlos, to the point where, with Carlos's left front starting to go, he forced him into a mistake in the middle of Beckett's. And we don't often see that. How often do you see a driver in P2 quite early in the race pressurizing the leader and forcing the leader into an oversteer mistake where he does one of these and has to go off the track and rejoins in second place? Very unusual to see that, and all credit to Max for pulling that off. But then 2 laps later, Max, seemingly now with the race in the bag, suddenly slowed because he'd run over some debris. The debris potentially would have been from Charles Leclerc's front wing end plate, which went on the first lap, and also from a Sergio Perez debris thing as well on the first lap. So there was quite a lot of debris out on the circuit. Normally they start putting out virtual safety cars when there's debris, but obviously sometimes it's very difficult to see it, and it can be very small in the case of carbon. Anyway, from Max's position leading the race, it felt as if something had just gone wrong with the car. So he came straight in, they put on another set of medium tyres, sent him out again. He was immediately asking them if there was anything on the tyres, had he got a puncture, for example. And the message came back, no, you've got underfloor damage at the rear, which of course is incredibly significant on these ground effect cars. If you've got any sort of problem at the back of the car, it's really going to affect your downforce. It did really well to finish in the points. Massive last lap battle with Mick Schumacher, who was on new softs at that point, running ahead of his teammate Kevin Magnussen in the Haas, driving really well as he had done all weekend, and as well as he did in Canada. And Max just got him, but it was a bit contentious because there were a few moments when Max was edging Mick right off the circuit. Very, very close racing as well in those last 10 laps, but great result for Mick Schumacher. Very disappointing day for Max Verstappen. About the only thing he could say is that he got a couple of points for it, but it was a debris-ruined race from Max's point of view. Otherwise, dare I say it, an easy win for Max. So that Charles Leclerc was the other major player, and he had this right front wing end plate come off. And you'd think with a ground effect car, maybe the effect of that wouldn't be as great as on the previous era cars, where there's a lot more downforce coming from the top of the car. But I was talking to a couple of aerodynamicists after the race, and they said, no, big time, that would have affected the car. So bear in mind, Charles Leclerc put himself in a position where he was pressurizing Carlos Sainz when Lewis Hamilton had found a real sweet spot on the medium tyres in the first phase of the race, and he was pressurizing Carlos to go quicker. And they had to end up giving Carlos an ultimatum, so he had to let Charles pass. And Charles then pulled away from Carlos Sainz. Unbelievable drive, as I said from the start of this video, that he was able to do that. I was looking for ways in which you could see ways in what he was doing with the car. The only thing that was pretty obvious was that going through that corner I was talking about yesterday, which is you go at the end of that first long straight, they go into that left-hander, and then they go into that tight right. I call it the double apex right. The only thing that was obvious there is in mid-corner, Charles was just getting this massive understeer on the car. No surprise, but he was just living with it, but making allowances for it with the way he got into the corner. So I think he just massaged the car superbly. I can't imagine there's any driver on the planet that could have done a better job than Charles Leclerc today. And he was going really well until Ferrari didn't bring him in. I just couldn't believe it. Going back to it, you probably think Windsor's going on a bit now, but to me, that was just the most basic thing in the world, just to bring the guy in. It's a free pit stop, basically. And if you don't take it, you might as well just knock the driver on the head and take him out of the race. I don't know what they were thinking. Anyway, he dropped down to finish fourth in the end. Now let's talk about Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes. We've been talking a lot over the weekend, particularly starting with Scarbs on Friday, about the updates on the Mercedes. Complicated floor, he said in a lovely phrase. Edge to the floor. And the car was definitely bouncing still, but it wasn't that bad. And the top speed wasn't that bad. Lewis said afterwards, the Red Bulls are much quicker in a straight line. We've got a lot of work to do. Well, yeah, what else is new? We know that. But for Mercedes to close the gap as much as they have, and to be as competitive as they were, I thought was really impressive. He did finish third because Sergio Perez drove really well in the other Red Bull after his first lap debris incident coming in. They changed the front wing and he went out and drove all the way back to P2. But for me, that was a bit of a disappointment. I think on the soft tyre at the restart, I think that Sergio Perez, albeit in P4, I think he could have won that race. I think that had Max been in that car, a bit like, if Carlos had swapped cars in Canada with Charles, I think if Max had been at Sergio's car at the restart with 10 laps to go, I think that you'd be looking at pretty close race with Carlos Sainz over the last 2 laps. But as it was, once Sergio Perez had had this massive battle with Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc, and it was basically Perez and Charles Leclerc doing this, and Lewis just doing a beautiful pass and getting past both of them. But of course, the big advantage was with Sergio Perez, and we saw the way he was able to repass Lewis with DRS. And then he just sort of stopped. He was then doing the same lap times as Carlos, then he went a bit slower and kind of gave up. I didn't hear any radio message from Red Bull to say, okay, settle for P2, Sergio. I thought he was going to win that race, and I think in a good Red Bull, and it was a good Red Bull by then, don't think it had any real damage apart from the front wing, which they'd already changed. It was a better car than the Ferrari, as we saw with Max. So I was kind of surprised that and it was Carlos leading the race, not Charles Leclerc as well. Not taking it away from Carlos, but even more reason for Sergio to have had a real go at him. But he did finish second. He seemed very happy with that. I would have thought that's quite a disappointing result, putting aside Max's day, for Red Bull, that Sergio didn't win that race. Anyway, Lewis Hamilton P3, what can you say? If he was going to do a race like that, he does it at Silverstone in front of this capacity crowd. They're mentioning 400,000 now as the number. I said yesterday, I thought, and I've read quite a lot about 150,000 being at the British Grand Prix. Of course, that's on race day. And there's no way in the world back in 1950 they would have had 400,000 in total, because qualifying would have been, probably 10,000 people. And if they did run on Friday, and I'm not sure they did, I can imagine probably only about 3,000 people there. So it wasn't sold as a 4-day weekend back in 1950. But in terms of race day crowd, obviously it was brilliant to see the crowd at Silverstone. 400,000 over 4 days. That's almost Indianapolis Formula One territory. That was still the biggest race as far as I know. It was over 200,000 on race day, and it wasn't far away from that on Friday and Saturday when Formula One went to Indy. Anyway, for Silverstone to do that, fabulous. And the shots of all the campers and the crowd, sensational. And of course, they wanted Lewis, didn't they? They wanted Lewis to be right there. And he was on the podium, which was wonderful. Early on in the race, in the restart, Lando Norris, both on medium tyres, Lando Norris in the McLaren with upgrades, going quite quickly now, as we said yesterday, got in front of Lewis. And so there we had, with George out of the race because of the first corner thing, then we had Lewis and Lando wheel to wheel in front of the British crowd. And what a thing to have Lando part of the future of Britain's Formula One age, with racing with Lewis Hamilton wheel to wheel. Once DRS was allowed, Lewis was able to breeze past the McLaren pretty easily and pull away from him. But I think it gives an indication, bearing in mind the Mercedes is a much better car now than it was at the start of the year, I think it gives an indication of how McLaren have improved with their upgrades as well. So full credit to them. And indeed, Lando finished 6th when the checkered flag came out, beaten by Fernando Alonso, who was in an Alpine that was just about, if not slightly quicker than the McLaren. Both of them ran really long 31, 32 lap stints on the medium tyre, but it was Fernando that just got the result ahead of Lando. So very, very good day again for Fernando Alonso. He was in that group that was effectively battling for 3rd place right at the end. In no particular order was Sergio Perez, Charles Leclerc, Lewis Hamilton, Lando Norris, and Max Verstappen, would you believe, who had made 1 million pit stops already in the Red Bull, trying to work out what was going on. He didn't like being put onto the hard tyre, so they put him on the soft right at the end as well. And then, of course, Mick Schumacher tagging right onto the back of that group. And it was a very, very impressive bit of wheel-to-wheel motor racing we saw. There was some amazing overtakes. So I think in terms of replays and in terms of teasers for the future, a lot of it is going to come from this British Grand Prix, particularly from that last session of racing for P3. So there we are. I thought it was quite impressive how Carlos Sainz throughout the 55 minutes when they were waiting after the first corner, first race, if you like, first race shunt, they were waiting in the pit lane, and we saw shots of various drivers falling asleep or looking at computer screens, doing this, doing that, waving to the camera. Throughout all of that, Carlos Sainz stayed in the cockpit of his Ferrari, helmet on. A couple of logical things about that, I guess. You know, once you're comfortable and you're set, you don't want to keep getting out of the car. I think that's one of them. And two, of course, he's then in proper radio communication with everybody to whom he wanted to speak, and he could just sit there with the thoughts in his head. But I think also the other thing about that was that Carlos, quite rightly, wanted to keep himself away from any politics within the garage. Probably didn't want to look at Charles, probably didn't want to look at any of Charles' engineers had they been around, and just wanted to focus on his day and his race. And I think in that sense he's done a very good job of isolating himself from all the stuff I was talking about earlier, the politics at Ferrari, and obviously the situation around Charles Leclerc, where he was going to be always pushing Carlos very hard in the race, because we know how quick he is. And the other thing, I think Carlos did a very good job at the restart, because there's Charles Leclerc in front of him. You can see he's on the hard tyre. He's on the soft tyre. Obviously, he knows he's going to be a lot quicker, but he knows there's going to be some issues, and he's actually got to pass Charles Leclerc on the road, and he knows he's got a lot of pressure from behind him. He knows how quick Lewis Hamilton has been. And I thought he handled those last 10 laps really well, to the point where when his obvious challenger, Sergio Perez in the Red Bull, eventually got to P2, he kind of just gave up because there wasn't enough time or scope to get the wins. I think right at the beginning, at the second start, if you like, I think Carlos's defense when Max was attacking was really good. And I think the last 10 laps as well, after the virtual restart, he was again superb in the way he controlled the race and controlled the little sort of mini situation in which he found himself. So yeah, a very deserved British Grand Prix winner. I mean, he's going to wake up tomorrow morning thinking, yes, I've just won the British Grand Prix. And he'll be a hero in Italy now, of course. I think the really interesting thing now will be how Charles Leclerc does handle this, because can you imagine if Nigel Mansell had been in that situation, or Michael Schumacher, or Fernando Alonso, or perhaps even Sebastian Vettel, I don't know. But certainly those first three in that situation at Ferrari, leading the race, and they don't bring you in to put you on the soft tyre, when everybody else around you is brought in and put on the soft, and you're left out on these old hards. Can you imagine what would have happened after the race, let alone at Maranello in the next 2 or 3 days? It probably will, behind closed doors, happen, but it's a different world now at Ferrari. It is, and I'm constantly amazed, I've got to say, by Charles' demeanour outside, and how he's constantly saying we race as a team and we win and lose together, a bit like Lewis, but he says it with a lot of sincerity. I think he really does believe it. But even Charles, it must be starting to get to him now, when he does all this stuff, and he's capable of passing Lewis Hamilton or repassing Lewis Hamilton on the outside of Copse. I mean, give me a break. With a car with no right front wing end plate, he's capable of that. And they don't put him on the right tyres for the last 10 laps. I mean, it's just, again, the mind boggles on that one. Anyway, that's it. I'll get this video done now. In the meantime, thank you for watching. I'll, of course, be continuing doing the videos on YouTube from every Grand Prix this year. But in the meantime, don't forget, I'll be live streaming on Twitch. I'll probably do 2 or 3 this coming week. Not exactly sure when, so watch Twitter. And if you can, go onto the Twitch platform, it'll always have the scheduled live streams I'll be doing. And some of those will be reflecting a lot of the events behind the scenes at Silverstone this weekend. So looking forward to that. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you again soon.